Let's talk first about the session beginning with Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Bennett advocating how less money could lead to better ISTEP test scores, and the House Speaker pushing to limit teacher collective bargaining rights. Lately, though, Governor Mitch Daniels has allocated a portion of the state's increased revenue to education concerns. WFIU's Ben Skirvin talked to lawmakers, lobbyists, and school officials about how they have adjusted their priorities as the session drew to a close.
Teachers from districts across the state were cashing in their sick days and personal days earlier this year to swarm to the State House in protest of Senate Bill 575, a measure that would place significant limits on teachers' unions and their ability to negotiate. The bill, put forward by a group of Republican senators, specifically lists 5 topics which are off limits when it comes to collective bargaining agreements, including the length of the school day, evaluation and dismissal procedures, and provisions which would force the district into a deficit spending scenario. State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Bennett says the limitations are part of a broader educational reform initiative.
We developed an entire comprehensive legislative agenda, understanding that in order for schools to be competitive, in order for schools to be able to be held accountable, we had to provide local school corporations flexibility. So the timing of this is actually part of the timing of an overall comprehensive legislative agenda.
A contention that Indiana State Teachers Association President Nate Schnellenberger says is false.
That simply is wrong. Collective bargaining and unions in this country have been the backbone of our country for a long, long time. And it seems like now that certain politicians and well, let me just say there's certain politicians who have a vendetta against unions, and they feel that the quickest way to weaken unions is to eliminate or weaken collective bargaining.
But Bennett, whose office, along with the ISTA, has been engaged in a contentious series of encounters via teachers' email inboxes, says he can list almost a dozen examples where teachers can benefit at the expense of students.
There are many things in collective bargaining agreements that have gotten there because of the structure of collective bargaining. This is not a Tony Bennett versus the union issue. This is a structure of collective bargaining where collective bargaining has not been changed since the original law was adopted and passed in 1973.
Part of the controversy stems from the fact that almost all of the reform efforts have been proposed by members of the Republican Legislative Caucus, potentially leading to a partisan divide. The debate over the future of charter schools in Indiana is among the best illustrations of the fundamental philosophical divide between Democrats and Republicans. Along with school vouchers, charter school legislation is part of an overall Republican educational agenda which leaders say centers around the idea of creating options in education. In other words, supporters of the voucher bill and charter school legislation say traditional public schools are not ideal for all students, and parents should be able to choose the schools that best fit their child.
This is not about proliferating charter schools or proliferating private schools. This is really about proliferating high-quality options.
Democrats, on the other hand, say many pieces of legislation which benefit charter schools directly damage traditional public schools. For example, funds which would be assigned to students attending a charter school come out of public school budgets.
The other factor are all the other bills that are going through this legislative session, because just the voucher bill alone, which allows parents to take money away from the public schools and transfer it to private schools, there's a fiscal note on that of $90 million.
Overall, charter schools have not performed up to par with traditional public school districts in terms of state standardized testing. However, on a school-by-school basis, charter schools show very little difference in terms of actual academic achievement, with a range of comparable test scores and graduation rates.
Terry, I want to come to you first on this, and I'm curious what you are hearing from teachers. Do they feel maybe hamstrung after this session? You've had the issues of collective bargaining. You've had the what Tony Bennett said is not the proliferation of charter schools, but there's certainly been a lot of talk about that and about vouchers. What are you at KEEP hearing about what teachers think about all that's going on this session?
Sure, Stan. No, really, this is probably a legislative session or a legislative agenda, the putting students first agenda, the governor and state superintendent, like none we have seen in at least a generation of students, dating back to 1999 with Public Law 221, which was the state standards assessment and accountability reform of that session, really probably dating back 24 years, though, to the A+ education reform package of Governor Orr and then State Superintendent H.D. Nevin. So this is a very aggressive legislative agenda by the Governor and State Superintendent. And so one of the 5 cornerstone pieces is the restriction to collective bargaining. And it looks like Senate Bill 575 is on its way to the governor. So the bill will greatly restrict what bargaining rights teachers have, what they can bargain at the table, and it will be restricted to just salary and salary-related benefits. And so teachers really do feel like they're under attack. Probably public education really feels, educators feel like they're under attack because of this session. When you throw in not only collective bargaining, but vouchers, charter schools, very little new money and funding in the funding formula. Probably the best news all session long that educators received was last week when legislative leaders and the governor announced an additional $150 million for public education, and of that about $23.4 million will go to fund full-day kindergarten annually. $15 million of that will be for teacher performance pay or incentive awards, and then the rest will go into the school funding formula. But those increases in the funding formula are very modest. We're talking 0.5% in the first fiscal year 2012, and then just 1% in fiscal year 2013. And then that's on top of the $300 million that has been cut each year over the last 2 years in the school funding formula because of the recession. So we're not really restoring those funds, but educators were really pleased just to get that minor or modest level of increase that was announced last week. So educators really do feel it's been a tough session for them. And on top of this, the superintendent over the last 12 months has announced several positive outcomes for public education. More than 81% of public schools have increased ISTEP scores. Graduation rates are up 6 percentage points since the class of 2008, up to 84%. We have more students taking the advanced placement test and scoring 3 or above on those. More kids are going to college, taking an SAT, an ACT test. So some would argue that we are showing improvement in our public education system, and why are they under attack now? But then the proponents of market-based reform will say we have a government system where there needs to be more competition and choice. So it's been a very fascinating session regarding education policy.
Quickly with Joe and then Brian, thoughts on whether teachers being under attack, as Terry said, could lead to changes at the ballot box come next year?
Well, I think that this particular Republican majority in Indiana, along with the other surrounding states, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, I've called it an Eminem moment, and for young people, they know the rapper Eminem. He does a song about having one shot and taking it. I think that the Republican majorities are really taking their shot here and saying, if we want to do anything lasting and we want to keep a lasting majority, we need to break that connection between particularly teachers' unions and the Democratic Party. And I think with the erosion of private unions, which we've seen in southern Indiana in particular, and of course northern Indiana, that is probably the strongest political connection right now. So I think that the only way to fight this will be at the ballot box in 2012. I think what the Republicans are probably looking at, if I'm going more into the political here, is that in 2012, the Obama re-election campaign will be ramped up. They are an effective political machine. They're probably going to bring a lot of votes with them, so those majorities may not be long-lasting. They may be a lot smaller by 2012, and this is the one shot to try to... I don't want to, I guess we're going to say break the unions, break the teachers' unions.
Brian, your thoughts on a blowback, as it were?
Well, there will be some, for several reasons, not the least of which is many members of the ISTA, for example, vote Republican. And when you've got a situation such as you've got in Indianapolis, they are laying off 257 teachers. They have a $20 million deficit. This is the budget bill, and be pleased to share it with you and let you read it later. There is in this bill a specific provision for removing collective bargaining for public employees. It's actually in the budget bill, and this bill is basically going to pass as it is. While you can talk about the extra money, I know I've talked to a couple of superintendents who said, well, gee, it's nice that we've got that extra money for all-day kindergarten, but we've already got that, we're charging for it, and we've got no place to put it if we got the money. Right. And Terry knows a lot more about that than I do, but there is the possibility of political blowback, because it goes far beyond just education and labor.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the budget. We'd, of course, be remiss if we didn't talk about the budget. And as we've mentioned throughout the show, the budget is the biggest concern facing lawmakers before they adjourn. And even though those revenues are projected to increase, House Speaker Brian Bosma and Senate President Pro Tem David Long both say the inaccuracy of previous forecasts has taught them not to spend the money until they're sure it's been collected.